Hello, my name is Cathy Harris, and I welcome you to Ukrainian Connections. Today is our first show where we will share with you through visits with guests and conversations about our Ukrainian connection to Thunder Bay, Northwestern Ontario, Canada, about Ukrainian culture, arts, history, many things. And we would like to share with you at each show a display of some Ukrainian artifacts. Some are historical, some are modern, either gifted or on loan. And today we have an exhibit here of items from the Huzan region of Ukraine. And this is an area in Western Ukraine in the Carpathian Mountains, where it has very beautiful, vibrant colors, as you can see today. We have a special guest today for our first show, Mr. Stefan Huzan, who will be giving us a historical perspective of Ukrainians in Northwestern Ontario. Welcome, Stefan. Tell us a bit about yourself and your interest in today's topic.
Hi, Cathy. Thank you for having me on your inaugural show. I'm very interested in Ukrainian history and our whole Ukrainian community. My personal background, I've been a planner with the city for 28 years, semi-retired, avid historical interests. So I'd been on the board of the museum of the Thunder Bay Art Gallery, had for 5 years a Ukrainian Thunder Bay Art Gallery on Simpson Street. So avid interests in history. And happy to share some of that information today with you because immigration is a big deal, especially these days with so many Ukrainians escaping Putin's war. And it's always helpful to understand where Ukrainians come from, what they bring with them, what challenges they face.
So maybe could you tell us a bit about the historical path of Ukrainian immigration into Canada?
Let me start with a really interesting story. The traditional date that marks the beginning of Ukrainian massive immigration to Canada is 1892. Two fellows from Western Ukraine initiated a big outflow of immigrants. 170,000 by World War I came to Canada. But what's interesting for us in Thunder Bay is the first Ukrainians that actually are documented to come to Canada came to Fort William. And they weren't settlers like these settlers. They were soldiers. They were part of the Demurin de Watteville regiment under Lord Selkirk that actually, on August 13th, 1816, captured Fort William. So Ukrainian former Cossacks helped capture Fort William for the Hudson's Bay Company way back when. First documented evidence of Ukrainians in Canada is right here in Thunder Bay. So that's a fascinating story. But it didn't start with just soldiers. There were soldiers, there were single workers, and then there were families. But the biggest family immigration was starting in 1892. And it came up to the prairie provinces. Scholars identify 6 periods of immigration, mostly bookmarked by war or the opportunity to escape Ukraine or leave Ukraine, And so each of those waves had a different amount of population. The first one I mentioned was 170,000 coming to Canada. Then between the two world wars, there were like 65,000. After the World War until Ukrainian independence, about 40,000 persons. Then between Ukrainian independence in 1986 to the invasion of Crimea, about 70,000. Since Crimea to this recent invasion, maybe 5,000. That's my estimate. I'm not sure the exact number. But since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, 167,585 Ukrainians have come to Canada just in the last 2 years. It's incredible.
Wow. And with these individuals, waves that you're referring to, how were they different as far as why they came. We talked about, you mentioned the wars and obvious conflict in Ukraine. But what made them different amongst the next waves?
Well, the first wave were Ukrainians from Western Ukraine, okay? In Western Ukraine, the territory of Halichna, which is predominantly the Carpathian area, Carpathian Mountains, and east to a certain distance, that area was under Austria-Hungarian Empire. So there was an opportunity to leave through Austrian passports. The rest of Ukraine was under Russian domination and far more difficult to leave. So in the 1890s, there were both push and pull factors causing Ukrainians to want to leave Western Austria. They were poor, they were crowded, they wanted opportunity to raise their families out of poverty and not be slaves to the land, and desperately wanted to leave. The pull factor was that at that time, Canada was seeking immigration. There were CPR and others were actively promoting immigration to Canada, saying, come here, and the government, come here and buy 160 acres, a quarter section for $10 as long as you settle it. And so that was a very big factor in motivating Ukrainians who were farmers in Western Ukraine to become farmers in Canada. And that was a huge contribution to the development of Canada. And it was a big deal. It was a big wave. Interestingly enough, even during that first period between 1892 and 1913, the war, some of that immigration changed, because when you look at it, the opportunity to travel was by train and by boat. And relatively speaking, that was revolutionary. Up till the mid-1850s, it was hard to move. It became a lot easier to move with new trains and steamships and so on, and telegraph technology. Those things allowed outflow to happen. But in the transportation network, getting to Canada, getting to the prairies was by boat to Halifax or Sydney, Nova Scotia, to Montreal, and then up the seaway to Fort William, where you got on the train to go out west. So those 3 points, Sydney, Montreal, and Thunder Bay, or Fort William at that time, and Port Arthur, those 3 were also places where immigrants saw opportunity to work. And perhaps they didn't have enough money to get all the way out to the prairies, or perhaps they were more interested in working in towns than being farmers. But over that period, these 3 towns, Sydney, Nova Scotia, Montreal, and Fort William, became the biggest centers of Ukrainian settlement that didn't actually go to the prairies. So that's kind of an interesting note. It wasn't Toronto, it wasn't other places, those were later. But in the early years, these 3 points were significant communities of Ukrainian settlement. So in Ontario, Thunder Bay has some of the oldest Ukrainian roots in Ontario.
Wow, I actually did not know all that detail. And then with the other waves that followed, what were most of the Ukrainian immigrants doing when they came into Canada then?
So, as I said, some of them then focused on moving to Ukrainian communities. But let's talk about Fort William, Port Arthur, because it's an extremely interesting period, that early period of Ukrainian settlement. And what evidence do we have of that? We have church records, we have archives, we have municipal records. And I love that first period of Ukrainian settlement in Thunder Bay. One of the earliest evidence is newspaper records. There's a record in 1903 of 2 fellows who died who were from Ukraine. So we know there were Ukrainians here in Fort William, in Port Arthur, in 1903. Before that, obviously, because they had already died by 1903. Then, if we look in other records, the oldest Ukrainian church, the Church of Transfiguration, which was established in 1910, they have church baptismal records, and they have funeral records and so on. And again, the earliest death in there is 1910 of a guy, Basil Khmel, who got run over by a train.
Okay.
The other two guys were actually, the two in 1903 were also CPR workers, and they got killed during explosions, dynamite activity for doing railway track. So you know that in that early period, a lot of the laborers came into town.
Okay, this is great. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back to tell you more. Welcome back to Ukrainian Connections. Stefan, you've been telling us about the first wave of Ukrainian immigrants into the Thunder Bay area. I'm wondering if you can tell us some more stories about this fascinating information you found.
So one source are some organization records, and in the Prosvita records, it noted membership of number of Ukrainians that were members of Prosvita society, and around 1906 is one or two thousand, and by 1911 it was like 7,000. So that gives you an idea of the numbers that were coming in. At that time, what's also interesting is, well, what was the size of Fort William and Port Arthur at that time? This was boom time at the lakehead. Boom time. It was massive amounts of growth. So what we're talking about, in 1892, there were probably less than 1,500 people in Port Arthur, Fort William combined. At the turn of the century, there were probably 3,000 to 4,000 altogether in each community at best. But by 1929, it was like 25,000 each. So we're talking, in just the span of 20 years, 40,000, 30 to 40,000 people moving into the community. All sorts of growth going on, industrial and so on. So that's a very dynamic period in time. But let me tell you a story about specific Ukrainians. So I mentioned before that the Demuron soldiers were the first Ukrainians to come to Thunder Bay, and they got land grants. Some moved to Perth in southern Ontario and some or elsewhere. But the next batch were single male workers. When you look at the data at the turn of the century, it was like 10 to 1 men, Ukrainian single men, and only 1%, 10% women at best. So women were scarce, and men came to work. A lot of them came to work, and then to make some money and go home, or else bring over the family once they've made some money. It's interesting because that kind of dynamic occurred in the 1910 era, and it's occurred in the 2010 era, where even from Ukraine, a lot of people go and work elsewhere in Europe to bring money home, and so on. But when we look at these workers, it's an intriguing era. There's evidence in Thunder Bay of the 1884 coal miners' strike. Laborers from Austria who were fired by Mr. Blaine of CPR got upset because he brought in a replacement gang of Jews from Winnipeg to work at the CPR. So these fellows were infuriated. They discharged revolvers. They brought out their knives, and they went on strike. And in the end, these Austrians were reinstated, and the Jewish workers were sent to work somewhere else. The point is that at that time, gangs of workers were imported and moved around all over the place. And whether those Austrians referred to in 1884 were just Austrians, just Slovaks, or whether there were Ukrainians amongst them, we don't know, because people from Western Ukraine under Austrian occupation were recorded as Austrians. So that's the coal miner strike of 1884. Again, dynamic era of growth. You know about the Winnipeg General Strike. Did you know about the gun battle in Fort William?
No, tell us, Stefan.
So, in 1906, over 1,000 men, mostly foreigners, labored in the Fort William freight sheds of the CPR. And this money was an issue. They were being paid next to nothing. Big strike occurred, and 700 men hit the pickets. it became the most violent strike in Canada at that time, 1906. On August 12th, there was a 2-hour gun battle. Several strikers and 11 CPR officers were wounded seriously. The Riot Act was read. And on the corner of McTavish and McIntyre in the East End there were 200 strikers, 168 RCMP from Winnipeg, militia there, and 10 city constables. The crowd of strikers returned back in a house-to-house search, and the police netted 30 guns and pistols. 8 of the strikers were arrested and went to trial. Ukrainians charged among them were 4 Galicians, which is part of Western Ukraine, a Vasil Handon for repeatedly taking deliberate aim and firing, Tony Botatsky for having done some firing, Joe Stalmuk implicated, Mike Terenchuk, who was observed, fired several shots.
Wow.
So that was a huge event right here in Thunder Bay. Obviously, Ukrainians were a big part of it because they brought with them a labor and a cooperative spirit from their whole background in Western Ukraine, and they brought that with them. The whole labor movement in Winnipeg and in the prairies, a lot of that is based on Ukrainian values for the rights of workers. So specifically, an outcome of that strike and that gun battle in 1906 was, the Fort William Police Department got organized and said, oh my God, we've got to deal with this. They built the Donald Street Police Station as a direct result of that. So the museum is today is because of that strike.
Oh, that's a great piece of history there. Thank you, Stefan. Can you tell me a little bit now about some of the other waves or even the current situation that we have?
Not yet.
Okay.
I still want to talk a bit more about the early era because the early era is intriguing. In 1913, the Methodist Church of Canada went and did a survey and an investigation into the East End, because both the East End, where the CPR rail tracks are, and West Fort were the 2 earliest areas of immigrant settlement. They were thus the working slums of where foreign workers went. And conditions in both of those areas were rough and tough. And environmental conditions and services were pretty poor. It was originally in West Fort. The beginnings of both the CPR system and the railway system and the grain elevators started there, but in 1903 they moved right on top of the former site of the fort in the East End, and that became the focus of CPR and railway activity. So West Fort is older as an industrial area and as a settlement area for immigrants, and then the East End, but the East End became far more significant. So anyway, in that Methodist survey of McTavish, McIntyre, McLaughlin, and Christie streets, they described it in detail. There were 40 buildings on that one block. There were 5 stores, 2 bake shops, 3 warehouses, 3 vacant buildings, and 34 dwellings. Those 34 dwellings housed at least 292 people.
Wow.
That's like 10 persons per dwelling, of which 149 were male boarders living in 22 houses along with their family owners. A typical small 5-room house was found to shelter 18 Bukovinians. The nationalities in order of predominance were Italians, Ruthenians, the old name for Ukrainians, Slovaks, Greeks, Bukovinians, another name for Ukrainians, Poles, Finns, and Romanians.
Wow. Thank you for that little piece. We're going to take a short break here and stay tuned. We will return to Ukrainian Connections to hear some more historical information from Stefan Huzan. Welcome back to Ukrainian Connections. Stefan Huzan, our guest today, will continue to tell us a few more tidbits about the pre-war history in our region.
So, Cathy, life was tough for dirty foreigners that immigrated and were laborers, necessary, but did all the Joe jobs and the tough work, cannon fodder in a sense for industry. In those times, 3 little interesting stories. First one, enemy aliens. World War I breaks out in the end of 1913. Anyone who is from Austria is declared by the Canadian government as an enemy alien. 24 prison camps are built across Canada, and over 5,000 Ukrainians and similar Austrians, mostly Ukrainians, are imprisoned there. And there are 85,000 that are required to register and report to the police once a week and so on. In Fort William, there were lots. Thunder Bay, story, December 17th, 1913, 50 workers from Fort William are taken on the train along with 10 police officers, and they're dropped off at on the rail line going north, Mackenzie Station. Get out of the train December 17th. Okay, boys, build yourself a prison camp. That was the birth of Kapuskasing. Those guys over that winter cleared hundreds of acres, built a prison camp, which was then a prison camp until 1920, and became the beginnings of the town of Kapuskasing.
Wow.
On the other side, and this happened in other communities across Canada, Banff was built by World War I, Banff Park by World War I internees in Western Canada. What's unique about Thunder Bay in that episode is that here in Thunder Bay, it was tough. We were isolated. There wasn't an opportunity for workers to travel around. And the police were really hard on Ukrainians. And as a result, they were all fired from their jobs. They had no money, they had no employment, and they couldn't leave. They were beginning to starve to the point where it became a disastrous situation, including Slovaks were also faced with the same situation. So in May of 1915, they wrote a petition to City Council, said, please save us. 1,200 persons signed this petition, and it's in the archives. In Ukrainian, half of them signed the petition, said, please help us. It was presented by a cover letter from then the first Ukrainian organization in Thunder Bay, which was the Prosvita Society, which was actually called the Chitanya, which means reading room, and it was a self-help organization. It was the Ruthenian Chitanya. And under a cover letter, they approached council and said, please save us. In fact, they said, send us to prison camp. At least we'll make 10 cents a day. Because there was evidence in the newspapers of them searching garbage cans for food, starving. The actual church records in that period, burial records, record an extraordinary amount of infant mortality because the mothers were starving. It's incredible. Sorry, I get emotional about that story. Oh. That's from the Liber Defectorum, the Book of the Dead from the Church of Transfiguration. You check it. Infant, died weekly, died, pages of it. Anyway, more on that story some other time. Talking about churches. In order to survive, they had to reorganize, and like the Prosvita, self-help organizations, you want to bury your dead with religious rites, you start creating church parishes. Transfiguration was established in 1910 as the oldest parish pretty well in Toronto, in all of Ontario. But it's not the oldest church. You want to know why? Because there was an itinerant priest, a Russian itinerant priest, Zvolit, who was serving the community because there was no resident priest at that time. And he was collecting funds to build the church, and people were offering 10 cents, and 10 cents at a time, and it was recorded in their little booklets. And then he absconded with $2,500, which was a huge amount of money in 1910 to the U.S. So that parish existed in 1910, but the church didn't get built until 1918 because they again had to collect more money and build the church. But there's a lot of interesting stories related to that. So after that period, Ukrainian independence was 1918. January 22nd, Ukraine declared independence. A lot of immigrants thought, we'll go home. But over the duration of the next 2 years, Russia squashed that independent movement, and Ukraine became a part of Russia. All of Ukraine, not just the eastern part. And after that, we have an interesting era. We have an era of anti-Ukrainian propaganda from Russia. And we also have a split in the labor movement. So up till now, you had a labor movement among Ukrainians who were interested in communal work, self-help, brotherhood. It was a communal socialist approach to work conditions. But it got fractured by foreign interests around right after the war to become super left-wing, communist, pro-communist, and then those factions started fighting and causing trouble to the nationalist factions, to the point where in 1923, the Prashvita Hall was taken over by the communists. The nationalists went to court, won it back. And all of that era, that type of antagonism, sponsored by Russia, continued on to Second World War and post-Second World War, and obviously we see it now in Putin's land.
So, Stefan, we are probably going to have to wrap this up now, but we do know that you have an upcoming talk on Sunday, October 22nd at 2 p.m. at the Thunder Bay Museum, and there is so much information and knowledge that Stefan is very excited to share, both about the hardships and the successes of Ukrainians in our community, our connections and our impact. And I'd like to thank Stefan for joining us today in our first Ukrainian Connections. And I know there's so much more to hear, and hopefully you'll all be able to come out and listen to his talk on October 22nd. And I'd like to thank you very much for all the work that you've done to pull all this information together. It's been a passion for you, I can tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy, for having me here and sharing a drop from the bucket.